All right, so in this video, we're going to be looking at the next reading signpost, which is Again and Again. And if you're looking at this example video, I'm going to assume that you've been through the introductory video where you learned about the Again and Again signpost. And just as a reminder, when you spot this Again and Again signpost, stop and ask yourself its anchor question: why might the author bring this up again and again? So we're going to look at some examples of this Again and Again signpost today with excerpts from the novel Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. I know a lot of people are familiar with that story. You may have even read it earlier in middle school. But if you're not, here's a brief introduction. Hatchet is the story of a boy named Brian who is struggling with his true feelings of his parents' recent divorce. Now, on a trip to the Canadian oil fields to spend the summer with his dad, the pilot of the Cessna he is traveling in suffers a heart attack and he dies. Brian must land the plane in the forest. Brian learns to exist in the wilderness with the help of his hatchet. So please follow along as I read from the first pages of the opening chapter. Brian, the main character, is seated next to the pilot of a small plane flying over the forest in the far north. Be on the lookout for those Again and Again signposts. Brian Robeson stared out the window of the small plane at the endless green northern wilderness below. It was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, so roaring and consuming and loud, that it ruined any chance for conversation. Not that he had much to say. He was 13 and the only passenger of the plane with a pilot named, what was it? Jim or Jake or something, who was in his mid-40s and who had been silent as he worked to prepare for takeoff. In fact, since Brian had come to the small airport in Hampton, New York to meet the plane, driven by his mother, the pilot had spoken only 5 words to him. Get in the co-pilot's seat. Which Brian had done. They had taken off, and that was the last of the conversation. There had been the initial excitement, of course. He had never flown in a single-engine plane before, and to be sitting in the co-pilot seat with all the controls right there in front of him, all the instruments in his face as the plane clawed for altitude, jerking and sliding on the wind currents as the pilot took off, had been interesting and exciting. Now Brian sat looking out the window with the roar thundering through his ears and tried to catalog what had led up to his taking this flight. The thinking started. Always it started with a single word: divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought, a tearing, ugly word that meant fights and yelling, lawyers. God, he thought, how he hated lawyers who sat in their comfortable smiles and tried to explain to him in legal terms how all that he had lived in was coming apart, and the breaking and shattering of all the solid things. His home, his life, all the solid things. Divorce. What a breaking word, an ugly breaking word. All right, so let's pause for a moment. I notice right away that Paulsen is using the Again and Again signpost. It's pretty obvious to spot. The author has Brian speak that one word divorce twice. He emphasizes it too by letting it stand alone as a one-word sentence. It was right here in the text. And Brian has obviously thought of it many times before because he says that his thinking always started with that word. If the thinking always starts this way, he's thought of divorce many times before. Now, at this point, I don't know exactly how divorce plays a part in this story. I mean, I can guess that his parents are probably divorced, but I have no idea what that has to do with his situation at the moment, being that he's in a small plane flying over the North Woods. Right now, it just doesn't seem relevant to his situation. So instead of just noticing it and going, there's something repeated, I'll ask myself the anchor question: why might the author bring this up again and again? At this point in the story, I don't have a good answer, but can bet that divorce will be mentioned again. So let's read on. Divorce. Secrets. No, not secrets so much as just the secret. What he knew and had not told anybody. What he knew about his mother that had caused the divorce. What he knew. What he knew. The secret. Divorce. The secret. Okay, so as you can see, that was quick. Just a few more lines, and we see the author using this strategy, this repetition strategy, yet again. So what have you spotted in the passage? Take a minute or two to just think about what you noticed. You might want to pause the video here and jot down your thoughts with regards to the Again and Again Signpost anchor question. Why might the author bring this up again and again? So pause right now and see how many possible answers you can come up with. See you in a moment. Okay, now you might have started with some thoughts like, his folks are divorced and he knows why, and that's fine, but you've got to go further than this. You need to think about why the author would repeat this. Yes, this Again and Again signpost is pretty easy to spot, but to realize that Brian's thoughts reveal how alone he is and how abandoned he feels, that takes some reflection. Later, when the plane crashes, he will be, quite literally, alone and abandoned. So this moment that the reader is including, it's kind of preparing us for what's going to happen next. These moments essentially foreshadow just how alone and isolated Brian will be later in the story when the pilot dies and the plane goes down in the North Woods. Now, you spotted divorce was repeated several more times, and most of us likely notice the repeated mention of the secret. So we're beginning to see that Brian knows something about the breakup, something that he's never shared. That's what he says. But why do you think this is important? Why is the author driving this home again and again? What are we learning about the character and his situation? Perhaps Brian feels a heavy burden knowing such a damaging secret and keeping it entirely to himself. This illuminates his feelings of loneliness, and perhaps that feeling is going to become important as the story moves forward. Well, let's read on. This time as I read, notice and note anything that you think is repeated, something the author probably wants us to notice is repetitious. So do that. Brian felt his eyes beginning to burn, and he knew there would be tears. He had cried for a time, but that was gone now. He didn't cry now. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel, feet on the rubber pedals. He seemed more a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot seemed to open up a bit, and he smiled. Ever fly in the co-pilot's seat before? He leaned over and lifted the headset off his right ear and put it on his temple, yelling to overcome the sound of the engine. Brian shook his head. It's not as complicated as it looks. Good plane like this almost flies itself, the pilot shrugged. Makes my job easy. He took Brian's left arm. Here, put your hands on the controls, your feet on the rubber pedals, and I'll show you what I mean. Brian shook his head. I better not. Sure, try it. Brian reached out and took the wheel in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals. The plane slewed suddenly to the right. Not so hard. Take her light. Take her light. Brian eased off, relaxed his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten momentarily as the vibration of the plane came through the wheels and the pedals. It seemed almost alive. See? The pilot let go of his wheel, raised his hands in the air, and took his feet off the pedals to show Brian he was actually flying the plane alone. Simple. Now turn the wheel a little to the right and push on the right rudder pedal a small amount. Brian turned the wheel slightly, and the plane immediately banked to the right, and when he pressed on the right rudder pedal, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off on the pressure and straightened the wheel, and the plane righted itself. Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little. Brian turned the wheel left, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. It's easy, he smiled. At least this part. Pilot nodded. All of flying is easy. Just takes learning. Like everything else. Like everything else. He took the controls back, then reached up and rubbed his left shoulder. Ah, aches and pains. Must be getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as the pilot put his hands on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian looking out the window at the ocean of trees and lakes. The burning eyes did not come back, but memories did, came flooding in. The words, always the words. Divorce, the secret, fights, split, the big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did, knew only that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come, and then the divorce, all so fast, and the court had left him with his mother except for the summers and what the judge called visitation rights. So formal. Okay, that was a long passage, all right? Now, what repetitions did you notice? Take a moment to recognize and think about those again and again signpost markers, and then ask yourself the anchor question. Why might the author bring this up again and again? So I want you to pause the video here and think about it. Okay, jot down your thoughts about why the repeated words, why those repeated phrases and situations, why you think they'd be important enough to bring up over and over. See you in a moment. Okay, you probably noticed, I know I did, that divorce is mentioned yet again. And many of you likely saw The Secret as another again and again moment. Hopefully, you reflected on the anchor question, why might the author bring this up again and again? And you considered why the author is repeating these words. You might be thinking about whether Brian feels responsible for the divorce, maybe because of a secret he knows and should have shared with someone. Or perhaps he's plagued by the secret because he wishes he didn't know it at all. Brian knows the secret that caused the divorce, and he hasn't told anyone about it. When we ask why the author might be returning to this again and again, what can we say? But all we know with certainty is how deeply troubled Brian is. But we've also thought about how alone he must feel with his parents splitting up. And he must feel alone in that small cockpit with a pilot who barely speaks. So if we were to continue with this novel, we'd have to see if this divorce and his feeling so alone because of it play the important role in the story that we've kind of been led to expect that it does. The Again and Again Signpost, it reminds us readers to be alert to repetitions. Those words, phrases, actions, or situations that the author shows us over and over. When we see them, we know that we need to pause and ask why the author is doing this. That's what we do, in real life, if we saw a friend doing or saying much the same thing repeatedly. We'd ask ourselves what that repetition revealed. So as you read in the future, be on the lookout for these again and again signposts. Think about the power of repetition and jot down maybe what you hear in your home or on a television show, on a movie that represents this pattern of repetition that we've been looking at. When you notice this repetition, make sure that you ask, why might the author bring this up again and again? Thanks for being with me through this explanation and example of the Again and Again signpost, and I'll see you in the next one.